morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carolyn Ornelaz, and today I'm presenting my senior thesis to you on the pen and the sword, which is mightier. Now, before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone a question. Everyone knows what this is, right? This is a pen, but it's not just an ordinary pen. This is a very special pen. Now, you may be wondering, Ms. Ornelaz, what is so special about that pen in particular, when there are millions of it in existence? Well, I'm glad you asked. This pen is special because it has the power to turn any one of your thoughts into written historical works. Consider oral history. It is often regarded as an unreliable source of history because, as it is passed down to our posterity, it is prone to exaggeration and molding. Now consider written historical documents, like Tacitus histories or the Declaration of Independence, which are written down by the eyewitnesses, instead of being passed down verbally. And these are often considered more reliable sources of history. So now consider someone's thoughts, which could be then written down in, for example, a book. People then read this book, form opinions on it, and act on this correspondingly. Consequently, these actions often result in wars and reforms that then become part of history that is written down in historical documents. And people read these historical documents and form opinions on them correspondingly. And so then this becomes the cyclical cycle, where people read the original historical documents, or they read the original historical volumes, and they form their opinions on this. And all this cyclical cycle always begins with the pen. And so in this, Sir Edward de Witten has this one quote from his play Richelieu, in which he says, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And because of this quote, we can see the beautiful abstractions between these two items. Now, in this quote, there are three important words we must first define: the pen, the sword, and mightier. In physical terms, the sword is mightier than the pen, because the sword can easily end life, and the pen would be a futile weapon against it. Metaphorically, however, the pen is mightier than the sword, and in this case, the pen would be defined as the manifestation of human thought into speech and then writing. The sword should be defined as man's ability to do acts of violence in any form, and mightier is used to not only denote strength, but also impact. And so in this, we see that actions come from thoughts that were then transcribed and shared with others. This harkens back to the cyclical cycle we previously discussed, in which the pen inspires the sword, inspires the pen, inspires the sword, etc. But it always begins with the cataclysmic inspiration of the pen. And so from this we can conclude that the pen provides the cataclysmic inspiration and justification for our reforms, and thus wars were fought with the sword. Now, there are four important historical examples we will be examining today, in which the pen proves to be mightier than the sword. The first of these is the First Crusade. And in the First Crusade, Pope Urban's call to the Crusade speech inspires the Christian armies to unite under one common banner to go to the Holy Lands to free their brethren from the Seljuk Turks' persecution. In his call to the Crusade, Pope Urban appeals to pathos by saying, "Your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help," which emotionally stirs his audience. By appealing to universal terms, such as you and your, all are drawn into this, and against one common enemy, the Seljuk Turks. In addition to appealing to unity, Pope Urban also appeals to individual desire by speaking of fame, fortune, and faith that can be gained through service in the army. So by speaking to fame, fortune, and faith, individuals are drawn to join the army. And as the army grows in numbers, the universal image of a unified army that can go and exact this religious justice comes to fruition, and therefore this religious justice can be executed in the Holy Lands. This religious justice becomes executed in the Holy Lands via war, because peaceable negotiations were not open. And so because the First Crusade is constituted with acts of violence and acts of war, it becomes an act of the pen, an act of the sword, inspired by the call to the crusade. Now, going next 500 years later, we come to Martin Luther's 95 Theses, made widespread via the printing press. And the printing press, in this case, was used to create successive copies of the 95 Theses. And now some may argue that these copies printed on the printing press are not valid forms of the pen. But this would be false, because even then, these are still valid forms of the pen, because they are the manifestation of human thought into speech and then writing. And so because of this, the Theses and the Bible have become widespread in the printing press, and people can now view Catholic discrepancies in the Catholic teachings versus teachings in the Bible. And they seek to correct these discrepancies, at first peacefully, but then have to revert to war, because the Catholic churches refuse to have peaceful negotiations. And thus the 30 and the 80 Years' Wars come about. In the 30 Years' War, the King of Bohemia tries to impose Catholic absolutism on his Protestant nobles. Because of the 95 Theses, these Protestant nobles were able to see that their religious rights were being trampled upon, and thus they rose up and rebelled in order to defend these rights. Consequently, in the 80 Years' War, Philip of Spain tries to impose his Catholic absolutism via the Edict of Blood, in which the Protestant documents were brought to be banned by this edict. And so, consequently, the Protestants rise up in defense of this so that they're not submerged into darkness by this Edict of Blood. And so in both cases, Protestant parties, because of the 95 Theses, were able to see how the religious rights were about to be trampled upon, and thus sought to correct them, first peaceably, but then through war. Next, we continue on to the American Revolution. And in this time, there was a great need, and so great men arose to pen great documents. And one of these great documents was Thomas Paine's American Crisis Pamphlet, in which he calls, "Not upon a few, but upon all. Up and help us. Lay your shoulders to the wheel. Better to have too much force than too little, when so great an object is at stake." These words, once read to the haggard Continental Army in the dead of winter, inspired them, in which they were able to cross the Delaware, weaken the enemy, secure French aid, and overall, their fight for freedom was refueled. These words inspired the Americans to fight for liberty, and so thus their mission was rekindled. Likewise, the Declaration of Independence, which was the counteracting document to the Acts of Parliament and the Declaratory Act, which limited the rights of Americans. The Declaration of Independence served as a summation of all the injustice done to the colonies by the British rule, and therefore they were able to have a call to action, the American Revolution, to correct these injustices. In both cases, both documents seek to provoke and rekindle the American thoughts of liberty and individualism and virtue, so that they may fight for what is right and save their rights. Now, thus far we have seen how the pen cultivates unity, liberty, and individualism, among other good, true, beautiful things. But what happens when this pen is misused? Well, in the wrong hands, the pen can divide and unite for the wrong reasons, resulting in an example like the Communist Manifesto, in which people are provoked to do things contradictory to the good, the true, and beautiful. In this, Karl Marx suggests that we do things contradictory to Locke's ideas of retaining private property and strengthening the nuclear family. Instead, this results in social and economical crises, resulting in the Bolshevik Revolution and the Vietnam War, which are communist wars. So Karl Marx suggests that instead of bolstering morals, we do away with them. We do away with religion. We destroy the nuclear family, and we take away all private property, making this rooted in evil. Marx suggests that everyone shall be risen on the same tide of prosperity. What he fails to realize is that this will only happen in a communist utopia. Real life examples of communist governments show that communism only plunges the country further into turmoil and struggle, making it a not good thing. And because of this, we see how everything written may not always be true and beneficial, and thus furthering the importance of having a strong historical knowledge so you can see when things are going awry and history is being repeated, and seek to use the pen to correct them. And so now, we have made the argument that the pen is mightier than the sword, but it could also be argued for the reverse. The sword is mightier than the pen. And thus far we have seen how voluntary actions are inspired by the pen. But what about involuntary actions? Aristotle says that there are two kinds of action, voluntary and involuntary action. And involuntary ones are considered as such when formed under compulsion or through ignorance. And so then therefore the argument can be made that since acts that are involuntary are formed under compulsion, they lack rational thought, and therefore the emotions come before the thought, making the sword mightier than the pen. And so from this, people think that all actions that are involuntary have no thought. But in reality, in every single thought, voluntary or involuntary, there is a limited line of thought called conscience. And conscience allows an individual to label their actions as right or wrong, advantageous or disadvantageous, etc. And so up until the very last moment of doing this action, a person can be considered to abandon or fulfill their action, and the consequences that roughly may come out of this, being good or bad. And so because of this, every single thought coming before an action, making the pen mightier than the sword. Others may argue also for Attila the Hun, who instead of leading through documents, leads through sheer power and bold leadership. His mounted horseback army, his constant capturing of Roman cities, and his single defeat being only once at the Battle of Chalcis are all tributes to the might of the sword. And because of this, the Romans were unable to defeat Attila, and therefore had to draft the Peace of Margus, a written document that ended the bloodshed. This pact was only broken by the Romans when Attila accused them of stealing and keeping his fugitives. And so in the case when the opposite may seem true, the pen actually proves to be mightier than the sword, because the pen is the only one that could stop the bloodshed when the pen had not the power to end the bloodshed, even when all was quiet. Throughout history, peace treaties have served as documents that stop wars instead of starting them. And so because of this, we see how the pen, even in this case, is mightier than the sword, proving to be the one that can end the bloodshed. And finally, people argue that the pen is an instant killer, while the pen can only advocate for this killing. But they fail to realize that the pen can advocate for this killing across generations, across years, across millennia. And the one primary example of this is Jewish persecution. And Jewish persecution began millennia ago in the Bible with the Babylonian and the Egyptian persecutions, and continued up to the medieval ages and the Christian and the Elizabethan era, in which the Christians cloistered the Jews into their own parts of society and made them take on the dirty jobs of usury and moneylending. In addition to this, they also berated them and punished them because they were taking on these sinful and dirty jobs. And so in this way, they were persecuted for something that they could not control. But perhaps the pinnacle of Jewish persecution comes during World War II, when Hitler and the Nazis cloistered all of the Jews into concentration camps, and finally into the crematoriums. In this and all these other examples, there is constant testimony of how these Jews have been persecuted and how this racism stems from different parts of history, rising up from generations. And all of these can be seen in different documents, like the Bible, like medieval testaments, and like Nazi and like World War II testaments of Nazi persecution. And so in all this, the pen has a lasting effect on the actions throughout history. So now we have examined the First Crusade. We have examined the 95 Theses, the American Revolution, and the Communist Manifesto. And all of these are the cataclysmic inspirations and justification for why their wars and their reforms were fought with the sword. So now I want to ask you once more, what is this? Consider all we have discussed previously. How, in the right hands, the pen can inspire, it can unite, and it can lead others to the truth. But in the wrong hands, this pen can cause chaos, it can divide, and submerge people into darkness. And so because of this danger, we should not ban the pen from society, but rather we should embrace its challenges and seek to educate ourselves and the people around us on how to use this pen properly. And we can do this by encouraging them to learn the proper history, on which history to repeat, and which history not to repeat. And in this, we learn how to properly wield the pen. And so I implore you, learn history, wield the pen, sow peace and not chaos. And above all, lead others to the truth. That is your mission.
So your argument bases a lot on truth, and you did a great job defining it. But how would you define the truth in your examples? So you've got multiple.
Truth meaning like a good, the true, the beautiful, those kind of things? Okay, so there is often a universal like truth, right? Like murder is bad and things like that. And oftentimes in all these examples, we see constant themes of liberty, of unity, of preserving the truth. And I think in all of those kind of become this collective truth, these ideas that are universal, they last through a millennia. And so if they didn't last through a millennia, they really wouldn't be truths, because in that they're not eternal. So these eternal truths are kind of what make up the composition of truth that I'm talking about, of how the pen is supposed to enlighten people, make them more knowledgeable. And that comes in a lot of other things like Aristotle's writings and Socrates' writings, and he talks about becoming enlightened. He talks about, being educated. And so along with being educated and knowledgeable, we come to have an idea of what goodness is, of who we are as humans, what drives humans, and also fundamentally, what is the truth.
So to find the truth, you must be educated. So most of the population is not educated. So how are they going to find the truth?
Then that comes into the part of how can we, as people who have knowledge of the pen, spread that to others in the world. And religion is often a good example of this. They go and they evangelize and they teach people how to read, and they teach them, it might be the Bible, but it is still a historical document written by the pen that promotes morals. And in other cases, even in the United States, we have schools and people are reading historical documents, hopefully in the schools. And so by reading these historical documents taught to them by people who already understand them, they themselves come to have a historical knowledge. And in this, they find out how to properly wield the pen. And so it's very hard to promote worldwide literacy and to have that, and it is very possible it could come at some point. But right now, we can only try our best to promote the pen everywhere in the world and to bring enlightenment. And even when we're, as Americans, may not be doing, like first world countries may not be there helping them out, people in third world countries are still finding ways to read and to promote these ideas because they're universal. They are true goodness, and true goodness will always come to those who are constantly seeking it, as we've seen with Frederick Douglass, as we've seen with all these slaves in American history who are wanting to read, and in other parts of the world where they have this drive for knowledge and is so strong that it comes to them.
So last question. Sure. What if someone educated does not interpret these truths the same? Because you have your Communist Manifesto.
Right.
Assuming they're educated, what happens with that different interpretation?
Assuming that they are educated in that way, their education has not been properly formed. And so, in this, if they truly understand the principles of the good, the true, and the beautiful, then they will recognize when their, for example, their natural rights are being abolished. Those are goods and truths that we are entitled to. But in addition to that, if they can't see that these ideas are perhaps infringing upon or going contradictory against the good, the true, and beautiful, then that means that they are still blinded and they have not been truly enlightened. Sounds good? Awesome.
I thought it was a really well-established argument. I think your thesis you can provide a lot of kind of counter-arguments to, I think. But one that I struggle with is, here's the question. One is there, did you consider kind of a symbiotic relationship between the pen and the sword without one the other? You know, that they kind of they need each other. And with that thought, when is the sword justified, right? When does the sword become the teeth to the pen, right? Without it. So what are your thoughts on that? When is the sword justified, right? When do you?
I think, as I've been mentioning several times, people often try peaceful negotiations first. Like the 95 Theses, the original Catholics as a group didn't want to break away from the church. They sought to, hey, can we peacefully correct these changes and maybe keep a united whole? But when one other party refuses to have peaceful negotiations, or when things are so far gone, like in the American Revolution, Parliament refused to listen to peace and negotiations. So the Americans still wanting this change and realizing that their fundamental liberties were at stake, sought to lure it towards. So in that case, the pen is justified when peaceful negotiations and other options have not worked. And so as we see, for example, in more modern history with the Communist Manifesto and the invasion of communism, communism fundamentally seeks to take away and destroy the rights of other people. It may promote unity and liberty, but that is not what it does. And so when you see something fundamentally going after other people and destroying these liberties, you have the right to take up the sword in any form because you need to defend it. And if you don't defend these liberties, at first with the pen and then with the sword, then you're not fulfilling the actions of the pen, which is your duty to go and promote truth and to protect people.
So kind of a follow-up, I guess, then the sword should be guided by morality.
Yes.
Okay, and then kind of in our society, right, with let's say the First Amendment, that kind of allows for those thoughts, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, okay.
Okay. Awesome.
Someone a good since she was first of all. Excellent research. I love all the historical references. And you and others here are blessed that you get to read all these amazing documents. And the pen has given us so much of these amazing things, but these things are now
under attack in some places, and people do not have access to them like you do. And what are your thoughts on that? Like some people are denied access to reading these documents, and so they're not formulating maybe the correct response because they're not seeing it.
Right. And I just cannot comment on that framework, because that's something that I researched very extensively, but it's such a fundamental undoing of these human rights. And so in communist countries, of course they oppress written documents, and they supplement people with their own communist ideology. And so in this, they're blatantly recognizing the power of written works, because they're seeking to destroy the ones that they don't like, and they implement the ones that they do like. And so in this, of course, it's very dangerous to go into these communist countries and to try and promote it. And there are people who go there and who are successful, but who don't come back. And so in that, they're fulfilling their own mission, and they're going and enlightening people. But we can also, from the outside, I think we can at least try to promote this. And people who come here from other countries and who share their experiences, they are key testaments to this. And so I believe that they are a key to helping us as well. But ultimately it does come down to morals, and whether the people in charge are going to be willing to, of course they're not going to be willing to promote the truth and beauty. And so in that we can only hope that eventually the people find some leader or some inspiration that shows them the truth, and they can come out of the cave, the allegory cave like Zach mentioned, and come to these truths. It's very hard, and it's very brutal reality that people are willing to use other people as essentially machines to get what they want to do. So we can only hope and try.
And we need people of your generation to do that. So make sure you guys use that too.
Do you have any questions after tonight?
I don't know.
Awesome, Frederick?
So, what is your solution for corrupt pieces of literature? Do we discard them, or do we teach from the errors of corrupt literature?
I love this question. We keep them. And now everyone may be like, whoa, why would you keep these pieces of literature? Well, so the thing is that when we read good documents like the Founding Fathers and things like that, we see the ideas that we're supposed to, emulate. But I read the Communist Manifesto. I read Mein Kampf. And everyone's like, oh, communist and fascist documents. I know, they're very frightening. But when you have a strong historical and foundational and truthful knowledge of what to study, then you know what you are looking for. And when things are so brazenly against those values of goodness, truth, beauty, liberty, etc., you can clearly see that, and you pick apart the arguments, and you completely destabilize them. And so having these documents, you promote the ones that you know are true, and you take those documents which are false, and you can tell people, hey, read this, but know that it is false, and that it is promoting false truths, because you know that it is contradictory to the good, the true, and beautiful. Okay, others? Josiah?
I was curious about the origin of the truth. Does the truth come from the sword? Like, in certain situations, like when the victor of a certain place sets about their law and everyone has to follow it, and eventually that becomes, the standard of what people have to do, the morals. Does the sword dictate what is good?
I wouldn't say the sword dictates what's good. If you mean by conquest and how the conquesting country comes into and instills their laws as that is what is to be true. In some cases that may be right. Their laws may be in line with what is universally good, true, and beautiful. But in other cases it may not be. And so I think whenever someone has to come in with the sword and to establish their rule, like for example in communism, they have to forcibly establish this. There is something very wrong with their ideas because people did not want to accept them. Otherwise, people would be willing to accept them very peaceably, and that means that in some sense they might be good, true, beautiful. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule. People may be blinded by false truth and things like that. But I think in general, if an idea is a good thing and it's a universal truth, the sword will not be needed to come in and take over. It would just automatically implement itself into society because of the people. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Lachlan.
What are your thoughts against the sword fighting back against false literature or against the false truth? So, for instance, the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, the colonies using the sword to fight back against the false truth that was Britain controlling the colonies. What are your opinions on that?
Of the sword fighting back bad literature?
Against false literature.
how would you, like, give me an example of how the sword would fight back against the
So like the Revolution, for instance, the Declaration of Independence, they used the pen, however, they still had to fight a war for it.
Yeah.
So is that still another example of just the pen being mightier than the sword?
Yes, that is an example of a pen being mightier than the sword. I wouldn't necessarily say the sword alone fights back against this bad literature, but the sword fights the originators of this bad literature and the things that come from it. Not to necessarily kill them, but in a sense to preserve the liberties that there are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question
Yeah.
in any way? If you're confused, please let me know. Okay, great.
So here you also say that another way that the pen is mightier than the sword because as a sword is like used to stab or kill, the pen is actually used for to motivate and like encourage others for society.
What's the question you're asking?
If another way for a pen is mightier than a sword.
Is there another way for the pen to be mightier than the sword?
Yeah, the sword can be used to kill, but the pen is also to motivate and encourage.
Yes, there is actually another way. So the pen, while it can also write physical words, can also draw images. And images are a universal sign. If I were to draw a picture of a cat, it may be a cat in English, but to another person in Spanish, it is still gato, but it still means cat. And so if I draw an image of a cat, everyone's going to universally understand it. And the pen is physically capable of drawing these images, which then can, in some ways, go and ignite action. If I were to draw a picture, per se, of someone killing you, you would be fearful and you would be angry, and so then you would act on these emotions to go and protect yourself. And so in this way, the pen can draw images that are universal across it and inspire action that way as well. Justice.
Okay, so in eras before those written documents, such as, let's say for example, the Native Americans, where they didn't have written documents, everything was passed down orally. In that case, what was going to happen? Since there wasn't a pen, there was only the sword, there was only conflict in this situation.
I did talk about oral history briefly in my introduction. It is an unreliable source of history because, as we see in much oral tradition, it is often prone to exaggeration and remolding. But it is still it can still be a very important way to inspire action because people they embody these mythologies and they embody these stories that they hear from other people's imaginations and their own thoughts. And so this then influences them to perhaps emulate their mythological hero, and so they and their battles, for example, would go and they would emulate their heroic deeds and their courage. And so I think in that way, these thoughts and stories are still able to be written down in the right capacity. But even if they're transmitted orally, they're still the thoughts and ideas in them that are in a way being verbally transcribed to other people and being passed down to generation to generation. Mr. Duval.
What happens if the written histories, the pen, is just as unreliable? So I'm thinking of, examples of like Egyptian history where, the history is written in such a way to be more favorable than is true to that pharaoh or that regime. What happens when, the written history is just as unreliable as the oral history? Like, how does that fit into your argument?
How does it fit into the argument? In that case, it is the historical written works. I think, we can only fire this.
Yeah, so do you think that I'm wondering if that's still, does that make your argument make more sense because the pen is capable of doing that, of twisting the truth? Or does that weaken the argument? Is sort of what I'm
You could argue that yes, the pen in that case would be proven to perhaps be misused, because in a way, instead of presenting facts the way they are, they're twisted in favor of one class. I know a lot of history often looks at the victor and then the defeated makes the victor look a lot more than they are, but in a way, they're still presenting facts in some way. So as an educated eye, we can kind of glean facts from it and take the very fundamental principle of it and maybe discard the rest as being perhaps extra or in favor of an extra party.
Yeah,
So,
maybe compare with other documents.
right, so there still is truth in that we can pull out in it. Does that make sense? Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, Gianna.
Hi.
Hi.
So, we are very common with the phrase that history often repeats itself in a lot of documents and a lot of happenings, the pen and the sword and so on. And so keeping that in mind, as humanity continues to live on and history continues to be made, would there be any extent that the pen loses its might because there's only so many times that something can be written? And is it possible that the sword could increase its might? And if so, would the pen still remain mightier and the sword would just have more heft? Or what are your thoughts on that?
So you're saying that over time, can the pen lose its power, and can the sword help boost its power?
Yes.
Okay. I think if the pen is written, actually, no, I don't think over time the pen can lose its ability to become impactful. If it's written on fundamental truths like good, truth, and beauty, then it will be long-lasting. Like John Locke's ideas were written 400 years ago, but they're still very influential in American ideas and promoting American governments around the world, American-like governments around the world. If we also look at the Bible's written teachings of, how to act morally and how to promote goodness in a way. The Bible has been around for over roughly 2,000 years, and so that Bible and the Christian denominations that follow it have been around for quite some time, meaning that there's some fundamental truth in there. And of course, the Communist Manifesto has only been around for 200 years, but it is a very impactful document. And the reason that writing of the pen is so potent and it has lasted as long as it has is because people are keen on believing it because they have not become enlightened to see the actual truths that are supposed to be long-lasting. And so, as long as we have people to continue believing the misused documents of the pen, they will still continue to be there. But when we promote the good, the true, and the beautiful, those documents will become long-lasting. And in this way, the sword is an amplification of the pen. The cycle of the pen inspires a sword, inspires a pen, inspires a sword. The sword is supposed to help amplify the ideas of the pen and to help exact them. But the pen is always the originator of this because the thoughts of men are transcribed and then inspire the action. Is that a good answer?
Perfectly.
Awesome. Any other questions? Or Ms. Feast?
That's a half hour.
What's that?
It's a half hour.
So what if we flip it, and since education is eroding as we need, what happens to the documents now that we can use for the documents in the future?
They become forgotten. And that is the unfortunate fact of it. But I would say, even when you have a handful of people who are able to see these documents, like, for example, all of us in this room and all the teachers in here, we have come to have a great historical knowledge and a great idea of what the good, the true, and beautiful are. And so, if we take on our mission of distributing this history all around us, then eventually people will listen. And eventually the evil, the bad that is happening, for example, in American government, will get so bad that people actually start listening because they don't want to hear these lies anymore. And so eventually they will discover the truth and they will discover people who are talking about it. Because there are a lot of people talking about it. I do know that there are. Eventually people will start listening. And when people start listening, these people gain like a large gathering and other people are heard. And so in a way, it just takes a few to ignite a spark.